Hello, everyone, and welcome to the unofficial Magic the Gathering audiobooks podcast. Your humble narrator, Phil Dawson here. Today, I'm going to ask each and every one of you if you can please support the Patreon over the next few months, as I have a goal I'm trying to reach, and your help and support can make that happen. That goal is to get my wife's best friend, Sarah, to visit here in Japan in October for my wife's birthday and have it be a surprise. All the proceeds from the Patreon support until then will be going to help cover those costs. And so whatever you can join up for, and we have tiers as little as $3, so less than a coffee, less than a pack of magic cards, you can sign up. I'll give you some background too, and the reason why this is important to me. My wife is the best. She's the one that has allowed me the free time to record these chapters. As many of you know, we have a young baby, now 9 months old, and she's been nothing short of spectacular as a mother. But along with those 9 months was the previous 9 months of pregnancy and, of course, the year and a half of COVID lockdown, which means, like many of you, she's been cooped up for far too long and only really gotten to see some family on occasion, and besides me. And because we moved all the way to Japan from America, which again was with her support allowing me to chase a wild dream, she's been unable to see her best friend in over 3 years. I want to change that. And again, this is where you can help. I have reached out to her friend, again Sarah, and she's making sure the planning works out, but I told her that I'd happily help pay some of the costs to get her over here. And even if it doesn't all go directly to Sarah, I'll hand it to my wife to make sure that she has the best time while her best friend is here. So I'm asking all of you listeners, if you think it's a worthy cause, if you'd like to make the year for two besties, for me too, because if this gets pulled off, I get like mega brownie points, and it's something that you feel comfortable supporting. I'm asking for you and your generosity to sign up for the Patreon, even if it's just for a month or two, as we try to make this happen. So, with that being said, find the Patreon link in your show notes, or search me, Phil Dawson, on Patreon, and thank you for your generosity and kindness and support in advance. I'll keep you posted. Chapter 9. The heavy wooden case Malzra had borne on his back turned out to be an elaborate desk. He unfolded it next morning to the surprise and delight of the breakfasting students. The surface of the thing was smooth ebony composed of various panels. Each blackwood panel slid out of the main compartments on hidden joints and fused seamlessly with its counterparts. The end result was an extensive, smooth tabletop, as wide as Malzra's arm span and twice as long. The work surface rested on cabinets with many small drawers and compartments. By some ingenious trick, the whole thing, cabinets and drawers and all, had collapsed easily into a compact box. More marvelous than even these capacities, no sooner than the desk was fully set up, Malzra drew open drawer after drawer, producing styluses, spanners, rule rods, compasses, protractors, a set of angle edges, and roll after roll of plans. He smoothed the last down atop the workspace, struggling to get them to lie flat, until Baron set a stone on each corner of the sheets. Baron and Malzra stepped back, allowing the gathering crowd of students to look on grand vistas in lead and ink. There was a soaring central hall with room to seat 400 students and scholars, a series of balconies overlooking the grand space, and an Empyrean vault open on one side to show the dense forest canopy. There were fanciful towers, rounded and lean like exotic gourds, some topped with guard stations, others with fire towers, and others still with observatories that bristled with optical paraphernalia. The outer wall was an enormous bulwark of earth and stone, with a notable absence of sewage grates and ductwork. Long curved corridors, great banks of jeweled glass windows, an aviary, aerial docks, gymnasium, a large rock-lined pond, gardens, and groves. The dormitories provided private rooms that were bright and open, no longer the cells of the previous prison. Every aspect of the design was marked with imaginative ornamentation, octopodal figures, fantastical sea prawns, Talarian drake head appointments, four-wind motifs, devices drawn from the naval architecture of New Talaria, gulls and kingfishers, anvil-headed storm clouds, tridents and coral and nautilus shells. This was not the stern infirmary of the previous Talaria. This was not a prison. Asceticism had given way to aestheticism, strict artifice to fanciful art.
Of course,
Mulzer said to no one and everyone at once. "We'll have to move the eastern gate from there," he pointed to a place on the plans and the corresponding location on the topography before them, "to there, allowing easier access to the safe path and the Englewood beyond." Baron assessed his friend. "I'm glad to see you've not turned the school into a fortification after seeing the Phyrexian rift." Mulzer smiled tightly, drawing a new plan to the fore. "They are the ones to be imprisoned, not us. Look, here, this is the first building. It would be everything to us to start with. Great hall and sleeping quarters and tutorial space. In time, it will be my private lab." He indicated a large lodge with walls of stone rubble and a peaked roof held up by tree boles felled and lashed together. According to the schematics, the initial roof would be thatch, but in time it could be converted to shake and eventually to slate. "It will stand there on that rocky ridge at the edge of the tent city. We start building it today." Breakfasts were forgotten in the ink and parchment visions of a bold, bright future. The whole encampment gathered around to hear their assignments. One ensign and his contingent were given guard of the camp, charged with setting up posts, building palisades, organizing a day and night patrol schedule, and assembling an arsenal. The guard group's duties would include the investigation and marking of temporal danger zone, as well as exploration into techniques for rescuing Teferi from his pillar of frozen time. Another ensign and her team were sent out to thoroughly survey the ruins of the old academy, cataloging whatever could be salvaged, block and brick, wood and steel, furnishings and artifacts. She was also charged with making recommendations for a site and structure that would be a memorial to the students and scholars who had died in the blast. Baron volunteered to join this group, as he was keenly interested in the proper disposition of any remains the group might encounter. A third group, called the Food Commission, was sent out with Joyra. They sought glades where they could set rabbit snares, pools in which to string lines for fish, and verdant fields for planting. Mulzer urged Joyra to make the best use of mild fast-time areas where hares and fish and crops could mature in weeks instead of months. Another team took up picks, shovels, levels, stakes, and twine. They began clearing the location of the new lodge and excavating a foundation per Mulzer's plans and elevations. Karn accompanied this group, intent on lending his strength to the earth-moving tasks. The last group accompanied Mulzer himself on a return trip to the Giant's Pate. There they initiated further study of the Phyrexian Gorge and suggested strategies and devices for the extermination of their century-old foes. Mulzer spoke of an ancient and minute device, a tiny crystal attuned to the glimmer moon and suspended like a lodestone in a drop of water. When the moon rose, the crystals were drawn upright and emitted a high-pitched tone that dismantled Phyrexian blood, breaking glistening oil to its component parts. By mass-producing these spiders, as he called them, and introducing them into the gorge through one of the rivers that flowed into it, they could hope to slay the whole army of Phyrexians before any of them knew what had happened. With the quiet and determined efficiency of refugee ants digging a new hill, Mulzer's company marched out across the strange and hostile hillside of Old Talaria. The tents that had sheltered them the night before fluttered, emptied and clean in the hot, shifting air of the summer. The columns of the fire that held up the black vault of night now smoldered in gray slumber. There was a sense of expectant hope in the air. Around axe-wielding arms and bent shoulders and shovel-prodding feet, there arose the airy vision of a new academy taking shape all around them. As the last sharpened logs were set in place about the tent camp and the foundations of the new lodge, a cool breeze moved through the surrounding forest. The summer's labors were done. Autumn had arrived. Workers paused. They breathed deeply, straightened their tired backs, and lifted grimy, streaming faces toward the sun. Life at sea had been no idle existence for the crew of New Talaria, but at least it had not held the daily back-breaking task of wrestling the earth, piercing it, digging it, lifting it, hauling it, dumping it, compacting it. The grit at sea had been largely salt, which washed easily enough away and provided the skin certain natural protections against insects. This grit was good, black earth. It coated everything evenly, never completely washed away, and smudged the books and scrolls that the scholars and students studied in their off hours. They were a brawny, tanned, industrious lot after their long months of labor, starting to look like Joyra, like natives of the island. The cool breeze riffled tents where students rested or studied. It fanned flames where a midday meal of freshwater fish sizzled. It kicked up dust from wheeled litters that dragged dressed tree bowls in place to the lodge's nearly complete vault. It rattled the roll of animal skins that would, when complete, become a great dirigible to lift Mulzer's Phyrexian war machine. The breezes seemed all too eager to bear the dismantled machine into the air. Most of all, the refreshing wind buoyed heat-weary workers, promising of cooler days and more rain. Barron drank in the air as he marched up the hill that led into the Palisades. Autumn would mean tall, dry grasses ready to be scythed and sheaved and draped into a roof for the lodge. The place would be warmer and drier than the tents and more resistant to mosquitoes and snakes. The prospects of real beds and real pallets was enticing too. Even so, Barron's uplifted mood came not from hopes of the future comfort, but from the completion of long labors. The ruins were fully scavenged. Every bit of usable stone had been hauled to the site of the new academy, many of the rougher pieces already incorporated into the mortared lower walls of the lodge. Barron's team had also discovered the wreck of the Hall of Artifact Creatures and rescued from that shattered place many operable pieces of machinery. These Urza had used to construct 5 Suchi lifters, units designed to perform the heavy tasks of the construction projects. The most important result of these scavenging efforts culminated today, though, and Barron had climbed into the encampment to gather Urza, Karn, Joyra, and any others not immediately employed to come see the result. "It's finished," Barron said simply, brushing dust from his hands as he stood before Urza. The planeswalker glanced up distractedly from the plans for his war machine, nodded, and gestured to a pair of students to remove the faceplate they had just attached to the metal framework. One of the young men gave him a look of consternation, to which Urza replied sternly, "We have to deepen the belly of that piece or the incendiary devices won't slide smoothly from the payload chamber. They might get jammed. They might explode within the superstructure. Now do it!" As the students set to work, Barron repeated, "It's finished. I'd like you to come and see it." Urza turned back toward his plans, which showed a fuselage of thinly tapped metal. The device, shaped like a horseshoe crab, hung beneath a great sack of heated gases. "I'm in the middle of something. Can it wait? Schedule a formal ceremony. I'll attend." Barron's eyes hardened slightly. 200 students and scholars died in that blast, Urza. Another 20 have worked long and hard among the ghosts of those 200, trying to find a way to honor them and remember them. If you won't come for my sake, come for theirs." "While you're mucking about in the past," Urza snapped, flinging a hand out toward the half-built war machine, "I've been devising a means to save the future. Just this morning, we learned why the spiders didn't work. Not enough moonlight in the cleft to activate them. This is our only hope. I have to complete this machine, or your monument might stand for all of us. I'm thinking about our future." In a gesture he rarely made, Barron took hold of the master's arm. He felt the hot surge of power beneath the man's skin. "Come see the memorial. It is why we are working for the future." Urza took one more exasperated look at the fuselage where the students swore quietly over their turning wrenches. He waved them off. "Come along, you two. Set those tools aside and come along. We're going to look into the past." They stared at him for one uncertain instant before his stormy brows convinced them to drop their wrenches in the dirt and rise to follow. Urza issued a similar command to all the students and scholars he and Barron passed on their way out of the encampment. Scores of tasks were abandoned, half finished, and the folk of Talaria flocked up behind their 2 masters. They had specialized in those long, hot months of summer, the guards different in dress and demeanor from the gardeners and hunters, who were different in turn from the artificers working on Urza's war machine, and so forth. In that spontaneous parade down to the time slough of old Talaria, all the scholars and students were one again, as on the day they had marched into the island. Jokes and laughter flowed out of the stern-faced master's wake, the sound of it not deadened or dragged down by the steady decrescendo of time. Barron wondered about this happy spirit. He and his scavengers had always adopted a solemn demeanor among the ruins. Not that much ruin remained. Despite the short days in that slow time spot, Barron and his crew had only 10 hours of sunlight during the 16-hour summer days. They had been diligent. The foundations of most of the buildings were still there, rectilinear crazings of stone moving through the hard-packed earth. Rainwater had gathered in the exposed basements of a number of buildings. Grasses had volunteered in many of the cleared areas. A few short walls remained intact, but most of the structures that had survived have been reverently pulled down. The cut stones were carefully sorted and stacked for use in new buildings. Even the field stone rubble lay in piles in the new camp. As a result, the old school now seemed almost a parkland with quiet meadows, wandering paths of stone, and placid pools. The ruins were ruins no longer. Barron's mood, too, lifted as he felt the final leveling of the temporal descent, and the parade wound its way into the heart of the place. A plaza had been laid, dressed stone set into an even mosaic between the 2 stunning sights there. On one side was Teferi, mouth still gaping and eyes still screwed tight, the eternal flames of his robes enveloping him, and the wet cloak descended only a finger's breadth. The leaning corner of a building remained behind Teferi, helping to shield him from the intense sunlight. As Urza and Baron paused beside this living shrine, Joyra emerged from the throng. She stepped up beside them and stared bleakly at her imprisoned friend. "He's trapped, like me. Alone, abandoned, neither dead nor alive." "We'll save him, Jorah," Baron assured. "We'll find a way." "He can't reach us. We can't reach him." Her voice held desperate anger. "If he tries to emerge, he will die." "Yes, we must save him before then," Baron replied. "Every night I rack my brain. I can't sleep thinking about him. There must be a way," she insisted, a trembling hand traced across her jaw. Baron took her hand and led her away from the spot. "Come, I have something else to show you." On the opposite side of the courtyard stood the memorial to the others slain in the blast. The base of the monument was an old foundation stone of the former academy. Urza had wanted the stone brought to the new school, but Baron was adamant. He said it should mark the beginning and the end of what came before. The side of the giant block of stone bore both its original inscription, Academy Talaria, established 3285 AR, and a new inscription, destroyed 3307 AR. The front of the block bore the names of the dead, and on the other side was an inscription in the ancient tongue of Yosha, which meant in translation, "The souls of a man who dies, standing in the teeth of fate, are the souls of all men, gone on ahead, that we may remain." The hollow interior of the stone held all the bones unearthed by Baron and his team, interned as they lived and died together. The stone was surmounted by a sculpture from the sketchbook of old Darab, Joyra's final companion in the months before Urza's return. Though his mind had been too fragmented to allow him to communicate well in words, Darab was an accomplished artist. Perhaps the most common image in his drawing was a seeking figure, gaunt and wind-torn, holding out a lantern and peering toward the future with eyes like twin hopeless pits in his skull. Baron had taken the metal remnants of ruined artifact creatures and welded them, one to another, into a statue of that bleak, searching soul, leaning ever against a ceaseless and silent gale. Joyra stared sadly. Baron stood beside her, still holding her hand. Urza took in the whole sight at once. The long caravan behind spread out into a semicircle to either side. All of them, student and scholar, artificer and guard, grew silent as they studied the memorial. Soon, only the wind spoke. Baron stood in that awed hush and felt an emotion swell through him. Something that was much joy as it was despair, something that darkened his eyes and made his lips clamp in a tight line. "On behalf of all of us left here after the blast, Master Malzra," Joyra said at last, "I want to thank you for this. It is right that this is the first finished building of the new school." "Yes," replied Urza with a decisive nod. "Yes, it is right." The new lodge was completed just before the wet drear of winter, and the embers in its two great fireplaces did not go out until spring was warm on the hillsides. Though better than the tents, the accommodations were still tight. The finished fuselage of Urza's flying war engine took up one corner, sitting atop the rolled animal skin balloon that was to haul it into the sky. The nighttime floor beyond it was filled to its edges with sleeping mats, and the daytime floor with tables of food being prepared and eaten. Books and plans were crammed into cobbled nooks in one corner, and the artifact experiments crowded another. So cramped were these accommodations that Joyra and her food gatherers chose to sleep and eat on New Talaria, where hammocks and bolt-head meals seemed almost luxuriant. Aboard the ship, she also had more room to pace the nights away, designing and discarding means of saving Teferi. It was a long, wet winter, and the only saving grace of it was the drive of Urza and Baron to push forward all the projects begun. By the first breezes of spring, a second building was half completed, a round-walled dormitory with each room opening outward to the four splendors of Talaria and inward to a central courtyard. Even without doors on the rooms and shutters on the windows, many of the scholars and students opted to move into the structure and brave the first days of spring. By the middle of that season, most artifact study had migrated to the central courtyard of the dormitory, and there was room for all in the lodge. Today the winds were right, mild and even. They flowed from the east, past the harbored New Talaria, up the very path they had taken back into Talaria. breezes coursed over the giant's pate and straight above the Phyrexian gorge.
10 years have passed in that gorge since our enemies first saw us, our return,
said Urza, sniffing the sea breeze as it breathed through the new academy.
Surely they have not been idle in that time. They are tenfold stronger than they were on that first day, and perhaps twice as numerous. Every day we wait gives them another week to prepare. It is time.
He spoke these words to Baron, but everyone who took breakfast in the lodge that morning heard him, and they all knew what he meant.
Today we attack,
Urza said. Most of those breakfasts went unfinished. Students rushed to their posts, excited and terrified by what the day might bring. Moments after this announcement, crews hoisted the balloon of animal skin and the metal fuselage from the corner and bore them up toward the crest of the giant's pate. Behind them went more workers with massive bellows hooked to specially designed forges meant to heat air. Ropes borrowed from the docked new Talaria followed in their turn, and crates of dark orbs carried gingerly by pairs of workers.
It is crude, I know,
Urza said with chagrin as he sat across from Baron, who was rapidly filling his mouth with 2 hot forkfuls of fried loon eggs.
But until we have a full laboratory capacity, I'm not willing to cobble together an ornithopter. Besides, this floating behemoth can hold 100 times the number of powder bombs as an ornithopter.
Even 4,000 bombs may not be enough to destroy them, and if any Phyrexians remain in the gorge, we'll be in grave danger, Baron pointed out, hissing between scalding sips of tea.
They are working on something, Baron, a way to escape, Urza replied. They've been searching for an escape for 110 years of their time. They mustn't have the metals or power stones for anything but a few crude artifact creatures, or they would be sending them out after us. They must be developing some new mutation, some new strain of Phyrexian that can escape their time rift. If one of the 4,000 bombs penetrates their biolabs and destroys generations of research, we will have bought ourselves another few years.
Yes, Baron agreed. He brushed off his hands and rose. Yes, today is a good day for this. I'll go brief the flight team. Urza caught the man's shoulder and shook his head.
No, let me do it. I'll be the one on board with them.
By mid-morning, the great war machine of skin and metal was fully inflated atop the giant's pate. Its airbags shone in the sunlight gold and brown, crossed in 1,000 places with sewn seams. Beneath, the metal fuselage gleamed, its base spotted with dew from its early morning trek. Strong winds up from the bay tugged and teased the dirigible, and its anchor lines moaned. The ground team worked busily among these ropes, as well as the 3 long tethers that would guide the machine out over the rift. Baron led the team through checks of the capstans bolted into the stone. Karn was there as well, prepared to lend his titanic strength to the haul on the lines. Meanwhile, the flight team of 5 was receiving its final instructions from Master Malzra. One team member was assigned to each vector of the balloon's movement, an officer of altitude, another of radius, and a third of tangent. Through a system of signals, these officers would instruct the ground team to accomplish the desired movement through a combination of rope trim and wind utilization. As Malzra's most accomplished artificer, Joyra was made officer of altitude, in charge of the elaborate onboard forge bellows that provided the machine its lift. The final 2 flyers, a scholar and her protege, were the school's best cartographers. They would lie prone in belly holds on opposite ends of the device and would each make maps of what they saw. Their work would prove invaluable in determining what sites to bomb, what resources the Phyrexians likely had, and what strategy to use in future strikes against the stronghold. Malzra, the final member of the team, was captain. Receiving information from the mappers, he would send instructions to the flight officers to position the machine and, at the precise moment, release salvos of incendiary devices. "The 6th bay is full, Master Malzra," reported a dark-haired young woman, breaking into Master Malzra's briefing. 500 powder bombs, 2 more bays, and the full complement of 4,000 will be loaded.
Good,
Malzra responded. His eyes seemed especially dark this morning in the gleaming sunlight. With a nod, he dismissed the woman and turned back to his anxious team.
Joyra, remember, at all times we must remain at least 1,000 feet above the top of the gorge, at the same height as the giant's pate. Even there, some Phyrexian projectiles might be able to reach us. 1,500 feet will be safer. The bomb bays and mapper bays are shielded, but projectile penetration is possible and could cause a chain of explosions that would destroy the machine. The crew had known all these facts before, but their repetition in the shadow of the leaning, leaping device widened eyes and brought uncomfortable gulps. If a projectile pierces the air sac, we will release all bombs and ballast and signal to be brought back. Escape will be impossible until we reach the Giant's Pate. Any who fall atop the time rift will die immediately. The scarp below the Giant's Pate is too sheer and littered with fallen trees to allow any safe landing, Malzra said. He studied the grave young faces arrayed around him. I hope you have said your goodbyes should we not return. If not, I have brought a messenger. He indicated a fleet-footed girl who obligingly tapped a shoulder satchel with quills and parchment. Avail yourselves in the next moments. We must be aboard once the final bomb bays are full.
4 of the 5 crew members turned quickly to the girl, selecting quills and nibs and beginning to scrawl what might be their last words. Only Joyra stood, resolute and ready.
Karn is here, and we have already spoken, she said by way of explanation to Malzra. The only person I would send a note to is Teferi. Of course, any note to him would burn up before I could read it.
Malzra's eyes narrowed in assessment of the young woman.
You must concentrate at the task at hand, Joyra. Teferi never leaves my mind, she replied. If I could trade places with him, I would. We needn't both be forever alone. He saved me once, you know. I did not, but if you cannot maintain focus, I shall have to find a different officer of altitude.
She dropped her gaze.
I'll fight all the harder thinking of him. Good, he replied. Let's take our positions.
Malzra laid a hand lightly on her shoulder, directing her with him toward the waiting craft. His touch felt almost searing. Joyra walked beside him. Shiny and glowing in the morning, the craft loomed up before them. It bucked slightly into the restless winds. Reaching the machine, Malzra drew back her rope slung across the doorway. He gestured inward and gave a gentle bow. Joyra preceded him into the vessel. She crouched as she scuttled down the tight passage. Her feet made small pings on the plate armor below. The bomb bays crowded either side of the passage. Ahead, the tangent officers' crawlways cut across the main corridor. The radius officer would remain in a seat on one side of the craft, monitoring the lengths of the rope anchoring them to the Giant's Pate. Joyra's post was in the exact center of the vessel, at the juncture between the fuselage and the balloon. She had sight lines in every direction and had memorized the height of the various landmarks. She also had an open shaft downward for a visual check on the ground position. A harness of hemp held her suspended in this empty column of air. The rig was designed to pivot in a complete circle, but otherwise provide a stable base. To one side of it was the forge bellows that Joyra would stoke and tend to keep the machine aloft. To the other side were a set of instruments, anemometers, barometers, compasses, spyglasses. Joyra climbed into the seat and strapped herself in. Malzra, in a similar rig in the belly of the craft, offered through a speaking tube. "Stoke the forge for liftoff." "Aye," Joyra complied, feeling small shudders in their fuselage as the other team members clammed into their positions. She faintly heard instructions spoken into tubes that went elsewhere. Beyond the superstructure, anchor lines were one by one drawn loose, and the ground crew took up the 3 lines that snaked around the capstans. "Cast off!" came the order in all of the speaking tubes. The craft lurched up from the rock. The nervous chitter of metal against stone was gone, and the rattling resistance with it. Joyra pumped the bellows before her, fueling the fire in the black box. A hiss of red air roared up from the forge. The vessel rose farther, heeling away from the stone. Beyond snapping lines and stretched skins, the bright brow of the hill retreated. The folk clustered thickly atop it, toiling at the capstans, were diminished. Soon their faces were only knots of exertion. Then there were no features at all, only bent backs and sinewy arms like extensions of the stout ropes themselves. A shadow-painted face of stone slid by below, descending suddenly into the vast distance. An immense bowl of land opened up. The Giant's Pate only became a ground-down prominence on one edge of the basin. Lines that had once seemed massive now looked all too thin, stretched across the plummeting spaces. "Take us up 300 feet to 1,300, Malzra's voice came. "Let's come in from above. Give us time to survey the pit and choose our targets." "Aye," Joyra responded. She slid back to the door of the coal chute, allowing a few more shards into the firebox. A lever spread the black stones across the embers. She pumped repeatedly on the bellows. Hot air jetted into the vast air sac above, and more tepid air spilled from the lips of the balloon. Impatient, the machine rose higher, its lines tugging it in an arc back toward the Giant's Pate. Malzra issued course adjustments, signaled to ground crews by the tangent and radius officers. The tethers slackened, and the machine swooped out on new winds over the black wound of the Phyrexian pit. "We're getting clear visuals," the map scholar said into her speaking tube. "A main fortification at the center of the cleft, perhaps 100-yard square with many turrets and towers, elevated battlements and scores of heavy ballistae, each target on the rim of the gorge." 33 ballistae by my count, the student broke in. Joyra peered down the shaft. She could make out the black form of the main structure and the bristling array of spear throwers atop the towers and rooftops. Even as she watched, the long shafts foreshortened.
"They're redirecting them at us," she noted urgently.
"Maintain altitude,"
Malza ordered.
"Remember, they have 10 seconds to R every one. They can respond, regroup, and re-gear quickly."
"The main fortress seems to be perched on a rock prominence in the center of a deep lake. I can't make out the contours of the bottom," the chief cartographer reported. "I'm surprised by all that water. Fast time rifts tend to have little water. It looks as though numerous streams empty into a gorge."
"Any signs of structures that might be laboratories?"
Urza asked.
"I'm looking specifically for spawning facilities."
"There seem to be fish hatcheries in various places in the lake," replied the mapper. "I can make out figures moving among the sluices and nets. As to the laboratory structures, I couldn't begin to guess." The assistant cartographer said, "There are various caves and what might be mines in the walls of the gorge." He broke off as the tip-tilted ballistae flickered into sudden, violent motion. Before any of the crew could blink, a flight of 33 massive shafts leapt into being 1,200 feet below. They raced up with preternatural speed, going from being wickedly barbed jags to being large as lightning. They rose to within 100 feet of the ship's belly before slowing and curving off. The ballistae bolts lingered a moment on the winds and then tumbled. Their heavy heads drew them quickly back downward, and they sank toward the temporal envelope where the Phyrexians were trapped. Striking the verge of the fast time gorge, the bolts accelerated to blinding speed. The crack of those 33 shafts smashing through rooftops was like manifold thunder. A cheer went up from the flight of the crowned crews.
"Excellent," Malzra said. "Maintain tangent, radius, and altitude. Stay directly above them. They'll think twice before sending another salvo. I am dropping the payload of Bomb Bay 5.
There came a great ratcheting sound as the doors of the bay swung slowly downward. Out tumbled the powder bombs. Just such devices had been employed with devastating effect at Corliss 3 millennia before, though they had been dropped in tens on marching troops instead of in hundreds on stationary fortification. Now the black objects, which seemed merely tumbling stones, rolled slowly in their swarm, gathered speed, and pelted down into the fast time rift. They struck the envelope en masse, making a distant, ominous patter. Accelerating to the speed of the rift, they struck. Light leapt from the cleft. Orange flares in their hundreds illuminated the previously veiled depths. Jagged roof lines and battlements shone in sudden relief. The cartographers scribbled frantically. Then smoke obscured everything in a deeper shroud, and blackness settled again. The sound of the attack lagged a moment behind this brief, pure flash, but when it came, the roar was amplified by the basalt fort, the glassy water beneath it, and the rocky cliff faces all around. It seemed a great beast had awakened, furious, from sleep. The noise filled the air for some moments, and then all was silent. Smoke, gray and white and black, and curdled rills bled from the gap.
"That got their attention,"
Joyra shouted, giving a whoop.
"Cartographers!" came Malzra's call.
"Target acquisition."
"Too much smoke," replied the scholar. "Give it a few minutes to clear."
"That will give them a few hours to regroup," Malzra responded. "Altitude, radius, tangent. Has our position held?"
"We've gained height," Joyra said. "After the bombs went up, we're about 1,700 feet.
"Bring us down to 12, Urza commanded. "And anticipate the next payload drop."
"Radius is ready. Tangent is steady. Down to about 1,200 feet. Payload 6 away." The first wave of attacks slew over 150 of Crick's minions, toppled 3 towers, blasted away the roof of the upper throne room, and, worst of all, sent blazing death into the spawning lab. Vials of brain and placenta burst and oozed. Recombination matrices ended in tatters on the floor. Vats of glistening oil ignited in enormous jets. Mutant stock burned to cinders, and the decanted, half-mature killers that Crick had been breeding to survive the time rift were roasted alive. The destruction was almost total. Almost. Out of chaos came order. The fires from the initial onslaught were already extinguished, the dead and dying thrown to the fishes, and the ballistae recalibrated for greater distance. Crick ordered all able-bodied beasts to salvage whatever specimens, equipment, and plans had survived from his breeding laboratories. The remains were taken below the castle into the caves. Urza's crude bombs might have blasted holes in roofs and walls, but they would not crack the basalt extrusion on which the castle sat, and would not completely wipe out a century of research. All hope of escape and victory rested in that ragged refuse, in the half-full jars of cracked glass with their skittish placental inhabitants. Some of the creatures would survive, and Crick's clawed and tentaculated horrors carried them as tenderly as human mothers with their babies. All of this had happened within the hour after the first attack.
As the smoke cleared enough to make out the dim line of the airship above, guards spotted more of the bombs resting in the air below it. They looked like pepper on a white piece of paper. It was an easy thing to predict where they would strike and evacuate the areas. Crick stood, furious and humiliated among his folk. Sizzling chunks of fire struck the roof of one guard tower and the adjacent section of wall. The resultant chorus of flares and pops shook the rest of the fortress and echoed through the chasm. Hunks of stone pelted outward and hailed across the Phyrexian host, who flinched away. The tower came to pieces, pulverized by the attack. The weakened wall crumbled away, crushing an armory lower down. Fires flared up wherever there was wood or cloth or skin to burn, and the armory ignited. A cloud of flame and soot shot up in a vast column, its top rolling and boiling. Crick watched. The filed teeth in his enhanced jaw ground into their opposite gums, cutting bloody rents in the flesh.
"What are you going to do?"
barked a creature next to him. It seemed more a giant flea than a man, its head 3 times the size of Crick's, and its pale, naked body humpbacked and twisted.
"You can't let this go on."
"Yes," Crick responded grimly. Pus-colored blood was suddenly jetting from the creature's severed back as Crick withdrew his sword. The monster tumbled from the wall where they stood, its body bouncing twice along the buttresses before striking the black foundations of the fortress and bursting in a white mess.
"Yes, cannot let you question my authority."
Crick turned to another Phyrexian, this one more manlike, though he had the infernal head of a haggard goat. The commander ordered,
"Tell 2 ballistae crews to fire 3 rounds every half hour. Half-cocked rounds that will fall short. Have crews ready in the water to retrieve the shafts. Cover the rest of the ballistae with dead bodies. I want Urza to think he has destroyed most of our ballistae and nearly disabled those that are left. I want to draw him downward. Once they're in range, fling the dead from the ballistae and fire all simultaneously. Aim for the flying machine's bomb bays."
Nodding his understanding, the goat-faced man headed off on his mission. Crick snarled at the minions around him.
"As for the rest of you, put out those fires and keep watching for more onslaughts. Anyone injured will be killed. Anyone killed will be defiled. It is your duty to fight and to live."
The 3rd, 4th, and 5th drops went as well as the first. Bombs hailed down, fire and smoke came up. The sound of tumbling towers and shrieking beasts rose to meet them. On the 2nd drop, Joyra had learned the trick of spilling heat from the air sac at the moment the bombs were released, thereby preventing the machine from lurching upward. This technique allowed for quicker follow-up attacks, greater accuracy, and less time spent reeling. Until the 6th drop, the gorge below was a gray scar so full of smoke that no fortification was evident within. Still, the cartographers had picked out landmarks on the edges of the cliff and could, from memory alone, pinpoint important sites to strike. They were above just such a site now, what had looked like a throne room or great hall, and Malzra issued a now familiar warning.
"I'm opening Bay 2.
Joyra paused a breath, then bled the air from the forge. She knew immediately that something was wrong. There came no grating ratchet. There was no sound of tumbling bombs. There was only the sudden loss of height as hot air spilled from the sack.
"The mechanism is jammed,"
came a shout over the speaking tube. Joyra ground her teeth as she struggled to shut off the bleed and pump the bellows. The dirigible sagged on its lines, dipping below the crest of the giant's pate. The deflated sack rattled in a sudden downdraft. Joyra heaved at the bellows, and jets of red air roared into the sack. It began to reinflate. Loud shouts of metal came below. Ballistae shots hammering into the fuselage. The speaking tubes were flooded with screams. Then came another wave of ballistae shots only a breath after the first. They penetrated. Spearheads struck powder bombs. With a dull roar, they ignited. The explosion spread. Bomb Bay 2 blasted away. The metal fuselage fragmented. The machine mounted up on a wave of fire. What remained of the fuselage rammed up beneath the air sac. Joyra was suddenly inside the balloon, the air around her baking her skin and burning in her lungs. She was aware of the great emptiness beneath her. Half of the fuselage was gone. The rest was shoved in a tangle of lines inside the skin sac. The other crew members were dead, the officers of the Tangent and Radius, the cartographers, even Master Malzra. She was about to die too.
"I'm sorry, Teferi,"
was all she could think to say. The ragged metal fuselage dropped from the airbag and slewed sideways. It tugged the deflated dirigible down behind it. The whole mass plummeted toward the Phyrexian gorge below. Coals from the tilted forge sprayed out around Joyra. Cursing, she clawed her way from the harness and climbed into the tangle of ropes. She clambered over them, seeing through their webwork as the vast gray gorge rushed up to swallow her. One of the ropes was fatter than the others and tighter. She grabbed it and felt the insistent tug of life on the other end.
"Karn is up there,"
she gasped to herself. Karn and the rest of the ground crew. She fought her way out of the flapping folds of skin and the taut net of ropes and clambered up that one fat line, the one that pulsed with life. Hand over hand, she dragged herself up the rope toward the giant's pate and away from the Phyrexian fortress. There was too much rope, too little air, too much rock. The world roared up with crushing weight. She climbed. The ruined dirigible was about 100 feet behind her now. It struck the fast time envelope. Waves of time distortion roiled out around it. The war machine plummeted in a sudden, preternatural rush. The rope snapped taut. It flung Joyra free. The capstan ripped from its mooring and surged through the air. There came a white-hot explosion within the rent. The sky and ground fused into a single sheet.
I'm sorry, Teferi.
Joyra struck earth, and all went black.
We do not make machines, I now realize. We make only fire and death. The blast surprised all of us, even Urza. He survived through a great concentration of will, holding his corporeal form together, but unlike the explosion that tore apart Tolaria or that which tore apart Argoth, Urza had not anticipated this one. He was struggling to keep his body solid even as his crew members were no more than red particles on the wind. There's no time machine for bringing them back. The blast surprised all of us. I summoned a wall of air trying to catch the falling craft, but only slowed its descent. In the midst of the fumbling hopelessness of it all, I saw Joyra ambling spider-like up the main line towards safety. That was the greatest surprise of all, though it shouldn't have been. Joyra's force of will equals that of Urza. Baron, Mage Master of Tolaria.